Growing up Hindu in America. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to those who are watching this from your homes and respective communities. My name is Siddharth Kaur, and like some of you, I grew up as a Hindu in America. Before I get into the specifics of what I'll discuss today, I would like to properly introduce you to the concept of growing up Hindu in America. Growing up Hindu in America is a series of talks starting today, so thank you for being here, to spark a conversation on that experience. It is meant to awaken your senses, feelings, and thoughts. It is not an intellectual analysis or meant to be an informational talk in the long run. The idea is born from the experience many of us go through. In America, you hear politicians and history professors speaking about America being built on Judeo-Christian values. The implication is that if you're not one of them, then you probably do not share some of those values with them. Many of them know or remember the counterculture of the 60s, where Hindu gurus were popularized through celebrity and new spiritual movements began. One can argue that this country's evangelical movement really took hold as a way to rebrand these Judeo-Christian values against the hippie movement. And while this dichotomy sprang up, in the middle of it all was a wave of Hindu immigrants who brought with them a more traditional way to practice Hinduism. Generally speaking, if you were not Hindu and you were American, to them, a Hindu was either a confused white Christian who decided to rebel, or a Hindu was yet another colored person that was expected to assimilate into America and understand what Judeo-Christian values meant, or else. And remember, we're talking about the 60s and 70s here. We've seen and heard it all. Hinduism is all about the caste system, as has been portrayed by world history textbooks in American middle schools. Hindus are cow worshippers and idol worshippers, often mentioned in derogatory terms. The sudden amnesia or ignorance of our fellow Americans and even our fellow Hindus, where the term Hindu gets disassociated with yoga or meditation. Aren't you all polytheistic? Don't you believe in like 330 million gods? Karma is fate. You guys pray to an elephant god, right? Or more infamously, Kali Ma Shakti De, as portrayed by Amrish Puri in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and other Hollywood stereotypes. Don't you all have a Bible? The assumption that all religions follow the same structure as Christianity. It's not easy growing up Hindu in America. The volume of information on Hinduism can seem daunting for anyone, let alone ourselves. How do I answer these characterizations or stereotypes? What does it mean to be Hindu? These are common thoughts and feelings, especially amongst my generation, whose parents immigrated here from India. It's tough because the majority in this country are familiar with Christianity. They ask themselves, what would Jesus do? And most probably assume that the rest are familiar with Christianity. But they look back at you and they see this. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalan, and I can't even pronounce his last name because it's a made-up Indian Hindu name, of The Simpsons, a fictional Indian immigrant from Ramatpur, West Bengal, who is a naturalized US citizen, holds a PhD in computer science, of course, and runs the Quickie Mart in the fictional town of Springfield. For us Hindu adults, in retrospect, it's not an ideal characterization, but we brush it off as part of American pop culture. But Apu was introduced to the world when I was in elementary school, and those can be tough years to be growing up Hindu in America. For the majority in this country familiar with Christianity, they either know the counterculture of the 60s or they knew this, Apu from The Simpsons. That's who we were to them. And so we carry this weight. The Hindu immigrant generation, their children, we both carried a weight of knowing that this ignorance existed, and it was on us to care and counter the false narrative and disinformation that existed. What ended up happening was the whitewash of popular Hindu concepts, some by Americans, but much of it by Hindus themselves. A half century later, we have come a long way, but we must understand the trajectory to learn how to move forward. The whole point of growing up Hindu in America is to better understand what Hinduism is. That's the point of this talk and this series. And what we can learn from it and share with our fellow Americans, whether they're Hindu or not. Today, we will begin the series by asking ourselves some fundamental questions. What does it mean to be Hindu? What is the history of Hinduism in America? How do we recapture our Hindu identity? Before we dive in, I want to make something very clear. This entire experience is meant to be spiritual in nature. This is a spiritual exercise. Think about that. It is meant to explore what it means to be Hindu in America and what we can do with that knowledge moving forward. There's much to say, much to listen to, much to reflect upon, and we must come up with a purpose going forward. As with any spiritual practice, generally referred to as sadhana in Hinduism, we begin with opening prayers and a resolution. Sadhana quite literally means a means of accomplishing something in Sanskrit. Prayers are called shlokas, literally in the name of religious deities, but symbolic in meaning. And the resolution is referred to as sankalpa, a single pointed resolve to focus on a specific goal. So we invoke the following prayers to engage in this talk in order to understand what it means to grow up Hindu in America and what we, all of us here, and all of you listening, can do with that knowledge moving forward. With that, please close your eyes. Keep your back straight. Breathe in and out. Relax. Take a deep breath. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kuru Me Deva Sarvakareshu Sarvada Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambam Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sadat Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwaraha Gurureva Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Growing up Hindu in America, many of us have heard these opening prayers, or some variation of them, and have no idea what we're listening to. We may know who we are praying to. We may even know some of the Sanskrit words, but generally, we just go through the motions, especially the younger generation. This isn't unique to Hindus living in the global diaspora. This is common amongst our ancestors, in the sense that we have a tradition that was passed orally. We're in the habit of listening and memorizing and speaking and practicing, but not necessarily understanding, contemplating, questioning, seeking answers that were traditionally not done by the masses. So why am I bringing all this up? Because this experience of trying to understand the sheer volume of detail contained within the universe of Hinduism, make sense of it for yourself, to your peers, largely defines the experience of growing up Hindu in America. Not only that, but it is important we understand the why to everything we mention and discuss. This is not unique to just Hindus in America, but all Hindus, whether in India or the diaspora. Before we begin talking about growing up Hindu in America, I asked you to clear your mind, relax, and focus. That's for the body and the mind. We then, 1, prayed for the removal of obstacles. 2, sought blessings for the proper study of this topic. 3, recognized that this knowledge comes from a teacher, a guru, and that the ultimate guru is God. But we said so much more than that. So let's hear the translation. First, we said Om. What is Om? Om is the visual sound and symbol of God in Hinduism. It is seen as the symbol of Hinduism alongside the Khanda for Sikhs, the Dharma wheel for Buddhists, cross for Christians, crescent and star for Muslims, and the Star of David for Jews. Vakratrunda Mahakaya. The literal translation is, O Lord Ganesha, of curved trunk and massive body, the one whose splendor is equal to millions of suns. Please bless me so that I do not face any obstacles in my endeavor. Saraswati Namastubhyam. O Goddess Saraswati, I bow to you, the giver of boons, the one who fulfills all desires. I begin my studies with a request that you give me your blessings. Guru Stotram. Guru himself is the creator, sustainer, and destroyer. He is verily the very transcendental divinity. My reverential salutation to that glorious teacher. So many flowery words. When I was a little kid, it's no wonder it probably just went in and out of my ears, and I had no idea that this is what we were saying. The deities we pray to have so much symbolism as well. We won't get into the details for this particular talk, but it's worth looking at just by listing them out. Ganesha, who's there, up here, and right here for your information, but can be displayed in a variety of ways. But generally speaking, a half man, half elephant deity who has large ears, an axe, small mouth, large stomach, big head, small eyes, a rope, one full tusk, one broken tusk, holds his favorite dessert, the modakam, and rides on a mouse. Saraswati has 4 arms, plays the stringed instrument called the veena, holds the authoritative holy book in Hinduism called the Vedas, holds the japamala or rosary, wears a white sari, sits on a lotus, and rides either a peacock or a swan. Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva are referred to as the Trimurti, or the 3 forms. The 3 cosmic forms of the supreme divinity in Hinduism, also known as the cosmic form of God. Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the preserver, and Shiva is the destroyer. All of this has associated symbolism. Ganesha has large ears because he's a good listener. So the idea is that he has big ears, he listens well, so you should also listen well. It's almost a lesson in a symbol. And they all have relationships. For example, Ganesha is considered to be Shiva's son. Saraswati is associated with Brahma. Among some Hindus, God personified is Vishnu or Shiva. Others worship the goddess or Devi as God personified. Others focus on God as the avatar, not the movie by James Cameron, but the physical manifestation of God on earth, such as Lord Rama or Lord Krishna. So when a Hindu is growing up in America, things can get very, very confusing very, very fast. It is easy to get despondent at the sheer volume of information available. It is both challenging, yet it's beautiful. No one is saying that we must understand every single detail of every single god. I don't even myself know how many total gods there are, because depending on what region you're from, it could be a different number. We're not trying to understand the ancient stories, the history, every deity, prayer, ritual, saints, sages, festivals, various holy sites, various sacraments, varying forms of spiritual practice, and the details of the philosophy behind it. But it is important that we understand the basics of Hinduism, so that when we grow up as Hindus, whether in America or in India or the rest of the diaspora, we know who we are and why we do. And ideally, we practice what we preach. We listen, reflect, and act. So let us be clear about our sankalpa. What is the goal today for which we are going to maintain a single pointed resolve to focus on? Remember, that's what sankalpa is. The goals are the following, as we've seen. Understand what it means to be Hindu, learn the history of Hinduism in America, recapture our Hindu identity. We are not necessarily going to fully accomplish the above, but we at least are going to introduce the basic aspects. This is meant to be a start, not a conclusion. But let us be clear about a goal. And for clarity, I will repeat the goals again. Understand what it means to be Hindu, learn the history of Hinduism in America, and recapture our Hindu identity. To be completely transparent, the majority of this first talk will focus on that very first line up here, what it means to be Hindu. As it should, because without that basic understanding, the rest does not mean much. If you do not fully understand what it means to be Hindu, then of what interest is the history of Hinduism in America? For what purpose do we recapture our identity? We must understand ourselves first. The first part to the story of growing up in Hindu in America is the most important part, understanding what it means to be Hindu. Before we dive into this, let me tell you a little story. So just last week, my family and I, and this is a completely true story, and everything I'm about to say is true except for this guy's name, because I didn't get his permission to say his name, but this has actually happened last week. My family and I, we were shopping for a new SUV, something comfortable for us and the kids. I have 2 kids who are sitting back in the corner there, and one who wants to come up here, as you can see. So, as you can imagine, with a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, our ability to be patient was completely out of our control. But somehow, we managed to take turns testing 2 cars out that we honed in on, that we thought maybe we wanted. Our sales rep was an older gentleman, Caucasian, in his 60s, and seemed to have a very Zen affect to his personality. I don't want to use his real name, like I said, so let's just call him Neo. And for those of us who I guess are older enough now, this is a character from The Matrix, or also, as you might know, Keanu Reeves. But we're going to call him this guy that we met at the car dealership. So Neo was a fairly chill guy. He wasn't drilling us with exaggerated details about car specs, not looking to make a quick buck, just going through the process with us. You would think that we would want to take our time and he would want to make a quick buck, but our kids essentially flipped the script on that dynamic. We wanted to be in and out. But Neo, for whatever reason, was letting us take our time. When it was my turn to test drive the car, he asked, "So, did you celebrate Diwali?" I presumed my religious background probably came up in conversation with my wife, who test drove right before me when they did the test drive. But I mentioned, just casually responding back, that we were in Marin County, and as we all know, during Diwali, the power went out for several days, and Diwali just happened to be right in the middle of that. So, of course, we did what we could. We lit candles and diyas around the house and said some prayers, all in the dark. Of course, the diyas lit everything up. So I said, in a curious way, "Are you familiar with Hinduism?" And Neo replied, "Actually, I lived in India for some time and studied various spiritual disciplines. I grew up in Australia and was introduced to the concept of transcendental meditation. I was initiated by the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi himself and got into TM, which is what they call it. So I joked, 'So you must know George Harrison of the Beatles,' as you can see. And Neo responded to my surprise, 'Oh yeah, we hung out.' He was really into Hinduism and especially TM. So here I am, test driving the SUV. I'm not thrilled with the car, but I really don't care at this point. I'm more interested in this 60-something individual who we're calling Neo, who is an Indian, yet who has studied various aspects of Hindu philosophy and practice in India, Australia, and the US. And that's not even the kicker. Neo goes on, I did TM, but it got political. And eventually, I got into Kashmir Shaivism. I'm a Kashmiri Hindu. Take it from me, this was the ultimate coincidence. So slight debrief. Kashmir, through the first millennium AD, was an important center of both Hinduism and Buddhism. It produced many Hindu philosophers and was home to Sharda Peeth, and that's what this is right now, one of the great Hindu temples and ancient centers of learning, hosting scholars such as Kalhana of Rajatarangini and Adi Shankara. But with centuries of invasions and religious persecution through the second millennium, the number of Kashmiri Hindus now number less than 1 million, and are all spread across the rest of India, since we can't be in our motherland, and the global diaspora, like myself. And not all Kashmiri Hindus follow Kashmir Shaivism. But here's Neo, this Australian man at this car dealership in Marin County, telling me about his experience with it. Kashmir Shaivism also happens to be what my father's side of the family followed in Kashmir. And the most recent authoritative scholar on Kashmir Shaivism was Swami Lakshmanju, the guru on my father's side of the family. So of course, this gentleman had not only met the Maharishi and George Harrison of the Beatles, but he also knew of the Kaur family guru, Swami Lakshmanju. Think about that. It must be the most complete coincidence, but it happened. Now, this story, and the reason I'm telling you this, is that it sets the framework of what it means to be Hindu. It sets the framework of the history of Hinduism in America and understanding what we mean by recapturing our Hindu identity. You don't have to be Indian to be Hindu. In fact, the history of Hinduism in America led to many followers, such as Neo, who was from Australia, a follower of the Maharishi, and Swami Lakshmanju, friend of George Harrison. It led to followers just like George Harrison of the Beatles. But there was also an aspect that Hindu Americans, especially the Indian immigrants and their families, have experienced. The negative stereotypes, the confusion. This is about how Hindus, whether we're Siddharth, myself, Neo, the Maharishi, George Harrison, this is about how we Hindus learn from our past and recapture our identity going forward. So let's talk about the main subject, growing up Hindu in America. 5 words broken down into 3 parts. Growing up Hindu in America. That implies 3 things. Growing up implies a specific experience. The one who's the experiencer, the Hindu, the ones who engage with the experiencer, whether Hindu or not, and the experience itself of Hinduism in America. Growing up refers to the experience of Hindu Americans amongst their Hindu and non-Hindu peers and friends. Let's break that down further. Hindu implies the ancient religion of India. The funny thing is, that very sentence is a very colonial sentence, but it's what we're used to. And this is what I mean by that. The term Hindu is not an indigenous term. It is an applied term by invaders and colonizers. Some say that when the Persians invaded, they refer to the ancient river Sindhu as Hindu. The land beyond the river Sindhu and the people who lived there were referred to as Hindu in the late first millennium AD. As the Greeks invaded, Hindu became Indos. And when passed to the Romans, Indos became Indus. And eventually, that turned into the reference to India. Take the term religion. The idea of religion as we know it is also a Western term. The Latin word for religio in classic antiquity meant conscientiousness, the sense of right, moral obligation, and duty. But as it currently is used, the modern concept of religion is a recent invention in the English language. This version entails a distinct set of beliefs or doctrines. But like Hindus often do, we adapted to this Western terminology. Our ancestors would not say that Hindu implies the ancient religion of India. If anything, they would say that Sanatana Dharma is the eternal law of Bharat. In other words, ancient India was called Bharat, and the religion our ancestors practiced and that we practice is referred to as Sanatana Dharma, as you can see up here. So what is Sanatana Dharma? Sanatana means eternal Dharma, is the inherent nature of reality. It is, at its highest form, that without which nothing would exist. I'm going to say that one more time because that can be very confusing. That without which nothing would exist. In simple terms, it loosely defines what we refer to as God. This principle, broken down at the human level, also refers to the cosmic law that establishes morality and social justice. So you may hear people say that dharma also means duty or law. But the duty or law are considered to be inherent because of our inherent nature, which is basically one and the same with God. The fundamental teaching of Hinduism is that our basic nature is not confined to the body or mind, but beyond this is our soul. And all of our souls, at an even deeper level, seek union with God. When this happens, it is referred to as moksha, nirvana, self-realization. The idea is that we are all on a path towards realizing this. All that we do, prayer, ritual, reading history, reading ancient stories, learning about our saints, sages, visiting various holy sites, conducting various sacraments, performing various types of spiritual practice, and understanding the philosophy, all of that leads to the idea that beyond it all, we are all on a journey to realize our oneness with God. The problem with that, and I experienced this growing up several times, is that that's a very big oversimplification. It's not that simple in Hinduism. Because when you get into the details of how we practice, or even quite literally how we define God, there are fundamental differences amongst us that must absolutely be understood. So before we say kumbaya and move on, let's get to know the details. Let's truly understand what it means to be Hindu. To do that, let's talk about Rohan. And you might recognize this from Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham. For those of you who don't know, it's a Bollywood film. And this character right here, when he's that young, is referred to as Laddu. But his actual name is Rohan. So Rohan, he loves laddus and other sweets. And he prays to Lord Ganesha when he's young. As a result, everyone calls him Laddu. And this isn't exactly how the story in the movie went, but I'm just taking some creative license to make it my own story here. So he just wants more laddus, so he prays to Lord Ganesha for basically a transactional relationship. He reads stories about Ganesha, sings hymns about Ganesha. He just can't stop talking about Ganesha because he thinks Ganesha is going to keep giving him laddus. As Rohan grows older, he prays to Lord Ganesha, knowing that Ganesha symbolizes the removal of obstacles. He believes that at some cosmic level, he is praying to an entity that will oblige. He has a personal relationship with Lord Ganesha. And this is obviously from the movie Agnipath, starring Hrithik Roshan, who played the older version of Laddu in Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gham, just in case you're wondering what the reference is. But what happens with Rohan as he learns more is he starts to understand that the obstacles in his way are not entirely out of his control. He recognizes there will be obstacles, but he is praying for the mental fortitude to overcome those obstacles. Growing wiser, Rohan understands his goal isn't laddus or to avoid obstacles, but to clear the spiritual path to get closer to God. He decides that this God personified is none other than Vishnu. And for him, Vishnu means absolute bliss or happiness. But as Rohan continues his spiritual practice, he realizes that he has a soul, as do all living beings, and that he will not realize true happiness until his soul merges with Vishnu through his love for God. That there exists a universe where souls exist, but also Vishnu, or the supreme God. But then something interesting happens. Rohan starts to question this concept. Does God have a personality? Is there something even more subtle than love? Rohan gets really deep into the spiritual study and realizes that there is something beyond Vishnu. Vishnu is God personified, but he starts to believe that God is beyond personality, beyond soul, not conditioned by anything. Now he refers to God as Brahman, the God principle without which nothing can exist. And what his soul yearns for is to experience that God, because nothing else to him now actually exists. I can see many of you are thinking, oh my God, you had me at Laddu and Shah Rukh Khan, and then you completely lost me. So I'm spending a lot of time on this concept of God in Hinduism, in Sanatana Dharma, because unlike other religions, Hinduism allows for the evolution of how we perceive and think about God. This is a very important thing for all of us to understand. And the latter two stages of Rohan actually mark a difference in philosophy amongst Hindus. Rohan's views change over time. From the outset, God is a transactional idol of Ganesha. He prays for laddus, and he gets them, but they're probably from his parents. But he thinks the Ganesha is hooking it up, so he just prays to the idol. Ganesha then becomes a cosmic deity who removes obstacles. Ganesha then becomes a vehicle for Rohan himself to exercise mentally on how to deal with obstacles in life. Rohan then decides, well, I've prayed to Ganesha, but I actually believe I have a soul, and it yearns for true happiness. And that true happiness is a personal God named Vishnu. Rohan believes that his goal is the merging of his soul with Vishnu through the true love of God. But then Rohan is convinced that there is something beyond a personal God, that God is actually beyond characterization, that there is no distinction of soul, God, universe. The whole point is that all is one and one is the same. And we call that Brahman. But the last two examples refer to the philosophical difference in Hinduism. One, you ultimately believe in a personal God like Vishnu or a supreme soul, distinct from individual souls that live in a real universe. And it's very similar to the relationship of individuals to God in the Bible. Or two, you ultimately believe that God has no attributes, that ultimately the individual soul and God are one and the same. And for those of you who are wondering, a couple examples of that are in Vedanta. You either believe in Dvaita Vedanta or Advaita Vedanta. And to you, God is that personal Vishnu, and you ultimately merge with him. Or God in Advaita Vedanta goes beyond that and has no characters. But without which, nothing will exist. So this can be very, very confusing for any Hindu. This is especially confusing for Hindus growing up in America because we are faced with seeming contradictions within our faith, but also with scrutiny and false questions from outside of our faith. The bottom line is that you can be Hindu, yet believe any parts of what I just mentioned about Rohan's journey or all of it. It could simply be an evolution in your beliefs. It is challenging, yet beautiful. And like Rohan, we must recognize that these different accommodations may be needed within one lifetime, as it is with Rohan in my example. And that's why we have so many tools in Hinduism available to us. So who are Hindus and what do they believe? All Hindus follow Sanatana Dharma. Sanatana Dharma refers to the spiritual path to our true and inherent nature. Thus, Hindus believe that the individual soul is on the spiritual path. What governs this process? At the level of body and mind, Dharma refers to a code of behavior and duty to be followed for the spiritual path. This spiritual path continues through multiple lives, as we believe in Hinduism, via reincarnation. The law of karma is the law of cause and effect of all of one's past actions in all of our previous lives. As a result, we inherently have a tendency to take a certain action, to think a certain thought, but we also have the free will to do otherwise. The individual soul's freedom from this cycle is referred to as moksha. And depending on your interpretation, moksha can mean the post-death union with a personal God or the realization that you and God are essentially one and the same. How do Hindus practice their faith? All Hindus believe in the authority of the Vedas, their holy scripture. Because the goal is moksha, all Hindus generally follow some combination of four paths of yoga to get there. Karma yoga, through right actions. Bhakti yoga, through devotion to God. Jnana yoga, through knowledge. And Raja yoga, through mental control and meditation. Hindus are free to internally perform mental worship or can perform external worship themselves or with the help of a priest, especially at a temple. Regardless of the ultimate goal, Hindus are free to worship God in whatever form they desire, whether Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, Ganesha, Rama, Krishna, etc., etc. You can name any one of them. Hindus can worship any form of God they want to. And they may even prefer to worship a saint. That liberty is allowed within Hinduism. And traditionally, they will follow the interpretations of a particular guru to help them on this specific spiritual path. But since this is very confusing, what's happened in more recent times is that the Bhagavad Gita, which isn't traditionally seen as an authoritative holy book in Hinduism, but what's been adopted as a holy book in Hinduism, has taken on a more prominent role. The Bhagavad Gita is an 18-chapter conversation between Lord Krishna and Arjuna, who you can see here. This conversation occurs within the great epic we know as the Mahabharata. And it's seen as a holy book that more clearly defines all the major concepts of Hinduism. All Hindus believe in the authority of the Vedas. According to Swami Chinmayananda, the essence of the Vedas are captured in the section called the Upanishads, the philosophy. And the essence of the philosophy is captured in the Bhagavad Gita. So let's go back to our friend Neo from the car dealership, friend of George Harrison of the Beatles. Again, these are two white guys, one from Australia, one from Britain, who each found their way to India to study different forms of Hinduism, both of whom ended up training under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. How did that happen? After all, Hinduism does not promote conversion. It is actively sought by seekers. To understand the answer to this, we need to fully understand how Hinduism came to America. Hinduism is identified with India or with Bharat, where more than 95% of Hindus currently live. However, the Hindu diaspora lives all over the world. In the 5th and 6th centuries, South Indians went as traders and merchants to Southeast Asia, to what is now Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Many of you know Hindus who live in Fiji in the Pacific Ocean, or Mauritius off the east coast of Africa. In the 18th century, Hindus came as indentured laborers on the islands of Trinidad and Tobago in the Americas, and in the 19th century, the same occurred in South Africa. But the 20th century saw waves of migration across the world, especially in Britain and the US. Specific to the United States, perhaps a precursor to this was the visit of Swami Vivekananda to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago on September 11, 1893. His speech was the first time the American public was formally introduced to and learned about Hinduism. The World Parliament of Religions was a gathering of practitioners of different faith traditions. 1893 was the first time Eastern religions, such as Hindus and Buddhists, were heard by Americans. Not considered, quote unquote, as good as Christianity, these religions were being included as part of an emerging group of world religions. Swami Vivekananda famously began his speech by addressing the congregation, "Sisters and Brothers of America." He spoke of Hinduism as a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. He spoke of belonging to a nation which has sheltered the persecuted and the refugees of all religions and all nations of the earth. Swami Vivekananda's key contributions were the introduction of Vedanta and yoga to the Western world, specifically in the UK and United States towards the end of the 19th century. He is credited for raising interfaith awareness and bringing Hinduism to the status of a major world religion, following his famous speech in Chicago. This was followed by Paramahamsa Yogananda, who spread the teachings of yoga in the United States in the early 20th century. His long-standing influence in the American yoga movement, and especially the yoga culture of LA, led him to be considered by yoga experts as the father of yoga in the West. Yogananda was the first major Hindu teacher to settle in America, and the first prominent Hindu to be hosted in the White House by President Calvin Coolidge in 1927. The LA Times dubbed him the 20th century's first superstar guru. Fast forward to the 1960s. Since the 1960s, a lot has happened. Prior to 1965, there were less than 50,000 people classified as Hindu in the United States, although most of them were incorrectly classified as Punjabi Sikhs, which back then was part of what was considered the Hindu umbrella. But now we make that distinction. The Bellingham riots of 1907 showcased low tolerance towards Hindus and Indians and Hindus. In the 1923 Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Bhagat Singh Thind, the Supreme Court ruled that South Asians were not free white persons, according to a 1790 federal law that stated that only white immigrants could apply for naturalized citizenship. The 1924 Immigration Act prohibited the immigration of Asians such as Middle Easterners and Indians. This changed in 1965 when the Immigration and Nationality Services Act, or INS Act, was passed. This opened the doors for Hindu immigrants who wished to come to the U.S. with their families in order to work. My parents were part of this earlier generation to migrate. This also included Hindu teachers and gurus who spread awareness of the religion. Also during the 1960s, Hindu teachers found resonance in the U.S. counterculture, leading to the formation of a number of movements, such as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, founded by Swami Prabhupada. You may know this as the Hare Krishna movement. People involved in the counterculture, such as Ram Dass, who was originally a professor from Harvard University, George Harrison, Allen Ginsberg, were influential in the spread of Hinduism in the U.S. In the late 60s and early 70s, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi brought what he called transcendental meditation to the States. He achieved fame as the guru to the Beatles and Beach Boys, among others. Rajneesh, aka Osho, was a controversial guru that came to the US, and I'm sure some of you have seen the Netflix series Wild Wild Country. While there were new movements occurring, many of which were rebranding Hinduism as something else, it is important to note other Hindu gurus who simply came to the United States to spread the knowledge of Hinduism. Some examples of this are Swami Chinmayananda of Chinmaya Mission, who you can see on the left, Mata Amrita Anandamayi, who is on the top right, and on the bottom right is Sri Sri Ravi Shankar of the Art of Living. Their organizations have a great influence on Hindu Americans to this day. Another phenomenon that's been happening, which many of you should be familiar with, is as is the case with the North Bay Hindu Center, is the movement to build Hindu temples. Although not formal temples, the Vedanta Society associated with Swami Vivekananda and the Ramakrishna Mission was responsible for some of the earliest temples in the US, starting in 1906. Some of the earliest temples include two that are local to the Bay Area. One is the Shiva Murugan Temple, who sometimes we have associations with, in Concord, California, which was set up in 1957. And also of note is the Shiva Vishnu Temple of Livermore, California, which is part of the Hindu Community and Cultural Center established in 1977. And finally, there are the missions set up in the US in order to further the spiritual and religious study of children and adults. This started with the Ramakrishna Mission, which set up the Vedanta Society in the United States. The first was founded by Swami Vivekananda in 1894, and there are now 14 centers. Almost a century later, the Chinmaya Mission incorporated in the United States in 1975 and now has 49 centers. Apart from the educational programming for children, youth, and adults, one of the most influential aspects of Chinmaya Mission was Swami Chinmayananda spreading the message of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita. In a religion which has much to offer and plenty of diversity, here was a simple answer to what we believe in. We believe in the Gita. And the Gita, summed up, as I mentioned prior, is the philosophy contained within the Vedas in a very personal and relatable way. And as some of you here do, you attend Gita study groups, which follow videos from this very Swami Chinmayananda. So this is the history of Hinduism in America. Whether we're in California, New Jersey, Texas, or in between, this is our story and our history. I want to conclude this talk with my personal story. But first, let me make a note about what I mean by reclaiming our identity. Some of the movements that I mentioned in the 60s and 70s, though not all of them, started a trend that's become quite familiar, where we distance the connection of the term Hindu and start labeling the practices or teachings as quote-unquote spiritual. Even though the teachings may have been Hindu and their teachers may have also been Hindu, they were not presented as religious, but in the generic form of spirituality in order to appeal to a wider audience. Even though Hinduism was being introduced to America, it may have not been explicitly identified as Hinduism. This may come very naturally to Hindus, as we believe our teachings are universal, but it has led to the commercialization and rebranding of some of the very concepts that Vivekananda brought with him at the end of the 19th century, namely meditation and yoga. My point being that we should recognize that while this country may be founded on Judeo-Christian values, The values and teachings that Hindus bring are universal, and they apply to everyone. And so we should have no problem saying that these are Hindu values. These are Hindu teachings. Just because we are a religious minority, and for the most part also an ethnic minority in this country, does not mean we need to hide our belief and value system. It is Hindu. We are Hindu. We should recognize this. This is very important. So my story as a son of immigrant Hindu parents is that of someone who experienced Hinduism from these varied lenses. There are specific teachings like yoga and meditation that spread like wildfire in the 20th century because famous celebrities started following them. But these very teachings seldom were identified as Hindu, as I mentioned. And for me, growing up in the 80s, this was very, very confusing. But there's also my personal upbringing. You could say I experienced it all from the Hindu immigrant perspective. My home worship was heavily influenced by my Kashmiri Hindu roots. Our temple worship was literally spending every single Saturday at the Livermore Temple because my parents became heavily involved, especially with my father serving on the board of directors in the initial few years right after the temple was built. My education in the stories, prayers, saints, sages, and eventually in the philosophy behind Hinduism, or the study of Vedanta, and attendance at spiritual camps was heavily influenced by Chinmaya Mission, whose Bala Vihar and Yuva Kendra program took up my Sunday mornings. And if my mom could drag me out, some of my Sunday afternoons were spent at Sai Bhajans, unless I really wanted to watch a 49ers game. If nothing else, I really got the full education and experience of Hinduism as a child. Still, it took me 30 years to make sense of all that is entailed within Hinduism. 30 years. Somewhere along the way, I even decided that I was agnostic. But then I remembered that one of the great masters that I followed, Swami Chinmayananda, was himself once a skeptic. He traveled to Swami Shivananda's Divine Life Society ashram in Rishikesh to, quote-unquote, expose the sadhus. This is Swami Chinmayananda, and he went to expose these sadhus. But it was there where he went from skeptic to an ordained Swami, and the rest is history. So I came back to Chinmaya Mission to help start up the local youth group, start teaching Bala Vihar classes, and now that I'm in Marin, I'm here to help the North Bay Hindu Center, not only in their goal of building a temple, but also to educate the local Hindu community. I keep going back to our friend Neo, the one from the Marin car dealership. He actively pursued much of what was handed down to me by my family. He sought out Hinduism as much as I was brought up in it. But we're all Hindus. The path forward is a shared experience, to share the hardship, but also share the highlights, clarify misconceptions, and remove all doubts about Hinduism. And I'm starting this discussion about growing up Hindu in America because the current generation of youth should be able to grow up Hindu in America with a better understanding of Hinduism, with a complete understanding of the history of Hinduism in America, and with the ability to identify Hinduism when they see it. Now that we have a solid foundation as to what it means to be Hindu and understanding the context of how Hinduism came to America, the next talk in this series will focus on common misconceptions of Hinduism. Once we know who we are, the next step is to remove doubts and questions. So I hope you join me in my next talk, and thank you for listening to me. Thank you to the North Bay Hindu Center for partnering with me and hosting this, and I'm actually now one of the same and part with the North Bay Hindu Center, which I'm very happy and proud to be a part of. Thank you to my wife and our children, even though they've been making a lot of noise in the corner over there, Ariana and Ishan, for patiently letting me see this through. And with that, let's conclude with some closing prayers. So again, I ask you to straighten your back, close your eyes. Part of doing this right now, and keep your eyes closed, is the meditative portion is being aware of what's around you. And if that's a 1-year-old screaming, so be it. But that being said, try to concentrate as we'll close. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। असतो मा सद्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गमय। ॐ पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। हरिः ॐ श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः। हरिः ॐ।